Deep beneath the mountains of western Iran, carved into solid rock and reinforced with layer after layer of concrete and steel, sat some of the most heavily protected military installations on Earth. These were not ordinary bunkers. They were engineering marvels designed with a single purpose: to survive a nuclear strike. Iran had spent decades and billions of dollars making them, in theory, untouchable. And for years, military planners in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh had stared at satellite images of those facilities and asked the same haunting question: could anything actually destroy them? Then came the night that changed everything. In the early hours of a tense spring morning, a sequence of events unfolded over Iranian airspace that would send shockwaves across every intelligence agency, every war room, and every diplomatic corridor on the planet. What happened was not just a military operation. It was a demonstration, cold, calculated, and devastatingly precise, of a weapons capability that many believed was still years away from operational deployment. The United States military had unleashed its most powerful conventional bunker-buster bombs against fortified underground nuclear facilities deep inside Iran, and the results were beyond anything analysts had publicly predicted. To understand why this moment carries such enormous weight, you have to go back to the beginning of Iran's underground fortress strategy. For decades, the Islamic Republic had been systematically moving its most sensitive military and nuclear infrastructure below ground. The Fordo enrichment facility, buried under nearly 90 meters of solid mountain near the holy city of Qom, was specifically designed to be impervious to aerial bombardment. Iranian engineers had studied American and Israeli strike capabilities with meticulous precision and built their defenses accordingly. They knew that most conventional munitions, even very large ones, could not penetrate that depth of rock and reinforced concrete. Fordo, in particular, was described by Western intelligence officials as essentially a fortress that could not be cracked, at least not with anything short of a nuclear weapon. Iran was betting its entire deterrence strategy on that assumption. But this is where things become far more dangerous than most people realized. For years, quietly and with extraordinary secrecy, the United States had been developing a weapon specifically designed to defeat exactly this kind of hardened underground target. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator, known in military circles simply as the MOP, is a GPS-guided behemoth weighing in at approximately 30,000 pounds. It is the largest non-nuclear bomb in the American arsenal. Dropped from a specially modified B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, the MOP uses its sheer mass and velocity to punch through tens of meters of reinforced concrete before its delayed-action warhead detonates deep inside the target structure. But even the MOP, in its original configuration, had limits, and those limits were precisely what Iran had engineered its defenses around. What defense planners and engineers at the Pentagon had been working on in classified programs for years was a series of upgrades, improvements to penetration capability, shape charge technology, and delivery precision that could push the MOP's effective depth beyond what Iran had calculated. And then there was a second weapon referenced only in fragments of declassified budget documents and whispered about in defense journals, an enhanced variant with capabilities that remain, even now, largely classified. When those weapons were finally authorized for use, the calculus of the entire confrontation shifted in a single night. The chain of events leading to the strike had been building for months. Iranian-backed forces had escalated attacks across multiple theaters. Diplomatic negotiations had collapsed. Intelligence intercepts pointed to accelerated activity at key nuclear sites. Satellite imagery showed unusual vehicle and personnel movements around the Fordo complex. The window, according to senior American officials, was closing. If action was going to be taken, it had to happen before Iran crossed the threshold that could not be walked back. The decision was made. B-2 stealth bombers operating from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean alongside additional assets launched from continental United States bases on ultra-long-range missions with aerial refueling support entered Iranian airspace without detection. Simultaneously, U.S. Navy surface ships and submarines in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea launched salvos of Tomahawk cruise missiles targeting air defense radar installations, command and control nodes, and surface-to-air missile batteries. The goal was to create a suppression corridor, a window of minutes in which the bombers could complete their attack runs without interference. The coordination involved was staggering in its complexity. What happened next changed everything. The first MOPS impacted Fordow in a sequence strike pattern. The first weapon punched through the outer layers of rock and concrete. The second, released in rapid succession along the same impact vector, dove through the cavity created by the first and detonated deeper within the facility's structure. This tandem strike technique, refined over years of classified testing, dramatically multiplied effective penetration depth. The underground halls where thousands of centrifuges had been spinning enriched uranium day and night, the heart of Iran's most protected nuclear program, were exposed to a detonation they were never built to survive. Similar strikes were carried out simultaneously at the Natanz enrichment complex, at suspected weapons development sites near Isfahan, and at hardened missile storage bunkers along Iran's western mountain ranges near the Iraqi border. The silence that followed was, in its own way, as powerful as the explosions themselves. Iranian air defenses, despite years of investment in Russian-supplied S-300 systems and domestically produced equivalents, had been blinded and bypassed. The stealth profile of the B-2, combined with the electronic warfare jamming provided by accompanying assets, had rendered their radar networks effectively useless. By the time Iran's military understood what was happening, the bombers were already out of range. The damage assessments that filtered out over the following hours, initially through seismic monitoring data, then through satellite imagery analysis shared quietly between Allied intelligence services, painted a picture that stunned even those who had planned the operation. The depth and precision of the destruction exceeded projections. But here is where the global consequences begin to multiply in ways that go far beyond the immediate military results. Russia, which had sold Iran its air defense systems and had a strategic interest in demonstrating those systems' effectiveness, found itself in a profoundly uncomfortable position. The humiliating penetration of Iran's defenses built in significant part with Russian technology, sent an unmistakable signal to every country that had purchased or was considering purchasing Russian-made air defense equipment. From India to Egypt to Turkey, military procurement conversations were already beginning to shift. China, watching with acute attention from Beijing, faced a different calculation. Iran is a critical node in China's Belt and Road infrastructure investment strategy, and the destruction of Iranian military capability threatens the security architecture that Beijing had been quietly constructing across the Middle East. At NATO headquarters in Brussels, the mood was one of cautious acknowledgement mixed with deep anxiety. The alliance had known this operation was being planned. Several key European members had been briefed, though not all had been enthusiastic. Germany and France had expressed private reservations about the escalatory potential. But privately, military chiefs across the alliance recognized something significant. The United States had just demonstrated in operational conditions a conventional precision strike capability against deeply buried targets that no other military on Earth currently possesses. That demonstration carries its own form of deterrent weight, not just for Iran, but for every adversary watching. And Iran's response was where things grew most unpredictable of all. Within hours of the strikes, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps placed all missile units on highest alert. Ballistic missiles capable of reaching Israel, Saudi Arabia, and U.S. bases throughout the Gulf region were fueled and brought to launch-ready status. Iranian proxy forces in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen were ordered to prepare for retaliatory operations. Hezbollah, Iran's most capable and heavily armed proxy, began moving assets in southern Lebanon. The Houthis in Yemen launched drone swarms at Saudi oil infrastructure. The entire region seemed to teeter at the edge of a far larger conflict, one that could draw in multiple state and non-state actors in a cascade of escalation with no clear endpoint. Yet something interesting happened in the days that followed. Iran did not launch a massive ballistic missile strike. Internally, according to fragmentary intelligence and statements from Iranian officials speaking through intermediaries, the scale of the destruction had produced something unexpected: genuine shock. The assumption that Fordo was invulnerable had been the psychological cornerstone of Iran's deterrence posture. When that assumption proved catastrophically wrong, it created a crisis of confidence within the Iranian military and political leadership that paralyzed decisive retaliation. Launching a large-scale missile strike against American bases or Israeli cities would invite a continuation of strikes that had now proven they could reach anything Iran had. The risk-reward calculation had been turned on its head overnight. International diplomacy moved faster than it had in years. Emergency sessions of the United Nations Security Council produced predictable disagreements. Russia and China condemned the strikes. The United States defended them as necessary preemption. European nations offered carefully worded statements calling for de-escalation. But behind the public theater, direct back-channel communications were moving through Omani and Qatari intermediaries at extraordinary speed. Both sides understood that the situation was balanced on a razor's edge. The question being asked in every capital was the same: where does this go from here? The strategic impact of what happened above and below the mountains of Iran is still being absorbed by the world's military establishments. For the United States, the strikes were a validation of decades of investment in stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, bunker defeat capability, and the integrated command systems needed to synchronize all of it into a single coherent operation. For Iran, the destruction of Fordow in particular represents not just a physical setback, but a fundamental reassessment of their entire national security doctrine. The facilities can eventually be rebuilt, though the timeline for doing so would be measured in years rather than months. The centrifuges can be replaced. But the knowledge that no depth of rock, no thickness of concrete, and no Russian-made air defense system made those facilities truly safe, that knowledge cannot be undestroyed. For the rest of the world watching, the lesson being absorbed in Pyongyang, in Beijing, in Moscow, and in capitals across the developing world is both simple and unsettling. The United States has crossed a technological threshold. The era in which a nation could protect its most critical military and strategic assets simply by burying them deep enough underground has quietly come to an end. The bombs that did this are real, they are operational, and they can be delivered anywhere on Earth with terrifying precision by aircraft that radar systems cannot reliably detect. The long-term consequences will unfold slowly, and the full picture remains uncertain. Will Iran seek to reconstitute its nuclear program through alternative pathways, perhaps underground facilities built even deeper, perhaps dispersed across dozens of smaller locations that are harder to track and target? Will this change the terms of any future diplomatic negotiation, making Iran more willing to accept constraints it previously rejected because it believed itself protected by geography? Or will the humiliation fuel a dangerous radicalization of Iranian policy, pushing leadership toward exactly the kind of desperate escalatory acts that this operation was designed to prevent? What is certain is that the night those bunker-buster bombs fell through the mountains of Iran marked a turning point, not just in the long confrontation between Washington and Tehran, but in the broader architecture of global military power. The rules that governed strategic deterrence for the past 3 decades were written when deep underground facilities were, for practical purposes, immune to conventional attack. Those rules no longer apply. A new chapter has opened, and the world is only beginning to understand what it means.